Welcome to Contact. I'm Craig Delahunt. On today's show, my guest is Adrian du Plessis, well-known stock fraud detective and a former investigator with the BC Securities Commission. Thank you very much for joining us, Adrian.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Adrian, how did you become an investigator with the Commission?
With the Commission itself, it followed after over a dozen years being involved in the Vancouver stock market, working as a floor trader, then as an investigator for lawyers and various clients, and exposing corruption primarily through the media as well. I applied for a job in mid-1993, and in late 1993 I was hired. There were 187 applicants. I was ranked based on my knowledge first out of the 187, and I was invited to join them in November of 93.
Were you pretty busy?
Was I pretty busy before or at the Commission?
Once you got in?
Well, less busy than I was in private practice. I think a lot of people knew what I didn't know going in, is that governments and bureaucracies tend to produce more paper than action. And I was used to being effective and sort of tracking down white-collar crooks and exposing cases. And at the Securities Commission, it was more like a lot of paper shuffling. And so I was busy in a sense that was not what I expected. I wasn't busy working, and nor was anyone else around me busy working on cleaning up the stock market. I was busy learning how governments work, how bureaucracies work, in effect how they don't work to protect the public. Basically, I learned a lot about government incompetence, negligence, and corruption.
So you were disillusioned by the Commission?
I was very much so. I had, and who knows why, again, a lot of people said, how can you be naive at this age with all the work you've done? But I still believe that the government, at the end of the day, cared about what went on Howe Street. The Vancouver Stock Exchange, which has earned the reputation scam cap of the world, and we've had all sorts of high-profile swindles and terrible crimes committed there, and our city and our province reputation has been tarnished because of the white-collar crooks in this city. I thought it was just the Vancouver Stock Exchange was the real sort of root of the problem. The government agency, the Commission, was overworked and underfunded was the myth that a lot of people outside believe, because until you get inside, the government is a much more secretive organization and tougher to figure out. So for years they went by people thinking they were, just needed more money and more manpower. But of course, Matkin, Jim Matkin, when he came along with his commission in 1993-94, first sort of popped that bubble and pointed his finger, saying that the VSE basically could not have become known as the scam capital of the world if the senior regulator, the government arm of the finance ministry, being the Securities Commission, was doing its job. At the time, I thought, maybe he didn't quite get the big picture, but when I went to work there, I realized he had it exactly right.
Well, doesn't the fact that the Matkin inquiry was commissioned show that the government was trying to clean up the market?
It shows, and again, a lot of these things, as we're realizing now with government, there's all sorts of layers to the sort of games that go on with politicians and bureaucrats. When Matkin was appointed, the NDP for years, through the late 1980s, when finance critics were Glenn Clark, Mosa Hoda, had been railing on, asking the social credit, the right-wing government, to clean up the stock market. So when they got in, and there were some big scandals that prompted it, a UK pension fund being built out of millions of dollars, old age pensioners in the West Midlands of England losing their money, and word of a contract being taken out on the life of a local business reporter, David Baines. Those things catalyzed the then Finance Minister, Glenn Clark, to appoint Jim Matkin to look into the VSE, the Vancouver Stock Exchange, and securities regulation in BC. But by the time his report was finished, we had a new finance minister. There'd been a shuffle in cabinet. Elizabeth Cull came in, who didn't have the background. She comes from an affluent riding, Oak Bay, Gordon Head, on Vancouver Island. And we've also seen, as our now resigned premier is being described in the press, a leadership that basically wants to be liked and doesn't want to make the tough choices and make decisions that could be controversial.
Well, did they follow up on Matkin's
No, they
recommendations?
wimped out. The government had the Matkin recommendations. The two major recommendations of Jim Matkin were to scrap the BC Securities Commission, replace it with a more aggressive, proactive body, something that was going to help change the culture of Howe Street, and his other major recommendation was to take away the self-regulatory power of the Vancouver Stock Exchange. In effect, the VSE itself is the source of where these crimes, or white-collar crimes and stock schemes and violations are occurring, but they're also there meting out justice and penalties to the violators. It's like the old boys club, and they're all in it together. So he said,
what you're saying is the fox guarding the chicken house?
Or the fox guarding the foxes. I mean, there's no guarding going on at all. So those two things would have radically altered the culture, or would have over time enabled the culture of Howe Street to be improved and addressed. But the government said, oh no, we won't deal with these 2 big ones, we'll deal with these 15 or so lesser ones. And so a cosmetic attempt was made. The government, as soon as Matkin made it clear to the NDP that he saw an arm of the government, the Finance Ministry's Securities Commission, as the biggest problem, he says relations grew tense, and they started working overtime inside the bureaucracies and at the Securities Commission to basically whitewash and you know, soften the blow of his report. So when it finally came out, it was watered down, and then ever since then they've kept stepping on it and cutting it down and watering it to the point where there are no substantial reforms that have really come out of it.
What led to your leaving the Securities Commission?
Well, besides the overall realization that half of the populace or more was right in knowing that the government isn't doing its job, and it wasn't the place that I had applied, I couldn't help public investors, I couldn't help the people who I'd been helping for years by working inside the Securities Commission. So that was the sort of big philosophical recognition that came to me. But there were a couple specific cases that have gotten a lot of publicity. There were many more, but 2 cases that have gained some notoriety since I quit were companies that were approved by the Securities Commission while I was there to raise more funds from investors in British Columbia, and there were serious problems and they were prejudicial to the public interest. The one company was called SciComm International. For years it had been advertising products that in some cases didn't even exist, you know, a black box that you could put on your VCR and it would zap out ads while you were taping your favorite show, when in fact there was no electronic wiring inside. It was a box with a logo painted on the side, and they advertised it in magazines to the public, things like this.
Now, what did a lot of the investigators recommend as far as receipts for this company becoming...
Well, the other people with me, we were unified, basically, and my bosses, the deputy superintendent, my managers, and the other investigators were of one mind as well, that these things were wrong, that we had sections of the Act that we could use to apply to stop them raising money in British Columbia. They could go somewhere else with lower standards. I mean, it's not any big deal. If you want to raise money here, you simply have to meet proper standards. The case in British Columbia is we simply say, well, we need the money. We don't want you to go to Alberta or Ontario, so we'll let any garbage or scam float here.
Well, you basically were recommending that they didn't get on the VSC. How did they get on?
Well, it's not so much getting on the VSE. The one company is listed on the Alberta Exchange, the one company is listed on the Vancouver Stock Exchange, and they both have other listings in the United States. But the issue is, through a prospectus or financial offering document, that they were qualifying, they chose British Columbia as the sort of venue for selling more shares. Both of them wanted to raise millions of dollars and used BC as the prime jurisdiction to sell through to investors. They were allowed to do this by the superintendent of brokers, who basically overruled staff recommendations that these things be nixed, that they were not good, they would be harmful to the public. The superintendent said he disagreed. He didn't give reasons, because he doesn't have to give reasons at the time. It's not a process open to public exposure. And so away they went. They raised the millions of dollars, and of course since then the stocks have collapsed and millions of dollars have been lost by investors.
Now, what did the investigators recommend with Camnet?
In the case of Camnet, again, the investigator on the file and his bosses, I wasn't the investigator on that one, they also recommended that the principal of the company, who had traded millions of dollars of shares in this company and another company without filing insider reports for years until he was starting to be investigated, they recommended that he be removed, that in fact the company with him aboard, his violations were so serious that this company could not be basically trusted to be fair to the public with him aboard. As well, at least 3 of the principals, who were then set up on a special committee. You know, we've heard also again about the NDP government's version of governing by committee. Let's strike a committee to look into the Nanaimo Commonwealth scandal. The commission on its own level does that, so they put in a special committee to oversee this fellow who had traded millions of dollars worth of shares without telling the public. And of those 3, all of them were in violation of the same sections of the Securities Act, and one of them himself had traded over $1 million worth of shares and hadn't reported it for years. So basically, you come back to the foxes looking after the foxes. And based on that, they said it was safe for the public. In fact, even the superintendent himself recommended that this fellow had to be removed, but somewhere between him saying that and a week or so later, when he decided to approve it, and no one knows why he changed his mind, he did a about face and said, no, this guy's okay.
Well, now what did you do when you quit? You basically presented something to Elizabeth Cull.
Well, what happened really was while I was still working for the government and working inside the Securities Commission, I wrote to Elizabeth Cull, she was my ultimate boss as finance minister, telling her that there were a lot of things going wrong and I'd be happy to tell her about them. She didn't contact me. So I realized you can't change the bureaucracy or the government from within, because all they do is gag you or silence you. And as we've seen recently too with the Nanaimo Commonwealth, those who speak up get fired or put to the back of the bus. So while I was in, Elizabeth Cull didn't want to hear from me. But as soon as I quit, in March of '94, I quit my job and spoke to the press. As soon as they started getting calls in Victoria from reporters for the Vancouver Sun and elsewhere, immediately Elizabeth Cull suddenly had a great concern for the public. I was then called over to Victoria, and I was still enough of a Boy Scout then that I thought, well, gee, maybe she was too busy when I was working there. So I went to Victoria, laid out cases about the Wolverhampton Pension Fund, which I referred to earlier, pensioners in the UK being ripped off by crooked VSE deals, SciComm, Camnet, others, Carlo Ciavelli, an insider trading violator, etc. And she said she'd think about it.
What did John McCollum have to say, and who is he?
Well, John McCollum is the man who oversees this giant pension fund. It manages $13.5 billion for a lot of union workers, a lot of civic workers, people in the West Midlands of England have their money, their pension monies tied up with this fund. For years, they had a fund manager who was cozy with some brokers and promoters here in Howe Street and was siphoning off the pensioners' money into phony VSE deals. They bought shares in a company that promised to grow the world's largest pearl. It was going to be bigger than a bowling ball. They had another one that had a cure for baldness. It would shoot a beehive-shaped head cone, shoot electrons into your scalp and make your hair grow. One after another, and they ended up buying into almost 50 scams in a row. Well, I tried exposing this. The VSE officials covered it up. In fact, they tried to blame it on a media conspiracy. They said that it was all me trying to expose, things that weren't there. They went to Wolverhampton to calm people's fears. The Securities Commission sat on its hands and did nothing. But John McCallum, when there was an election in May of last year, he took over the position, started investigating, realized that they'd been ripped off and scammed. The fund manager resigned. Another council member, as he put it, left in only her socks, left town in her socks, and they have now started to clean out. They've sold all, and they're as much as they can. Some things you can't sell. They're clearing out all the garbage in the VSE stocks that they bought and trying to protect their pensioners' money.
How do you think this is going to affect international investment in BC?
Well, it's just one example of money that won't come here because of the failure of this jurisdiction, of this government, the NDP, no different than the Socreds before it, or the Liberals to come, or the NDP to come. It doesn't seem to matter if they're right or left. They all fail to protect the public in areas of the stock market. But here's $13.5 billion that had been open, and money would have come to Canada, would have come to British Columbia to create jobs in all sorts of areas. Instead, because they were robbed and ripped off and lied to, not 1 cent of that money is going to come here. So well, a lot of people don't realize that the VSE is more than just sort of a gambling den in the back corner, that people can say, oh, we have nothing to do with it. This is real money that could have come to help build work, build, things in British Columbia, in this province. Instead, it's going to go to other countries.
You mentioned the opposition. The Liberals have been very quiet on this, unlike the NDP when they were the opposition. Why is that?
Well, why is this? Is the Liberals, the Gordon Campbell Liberals, are the party of Howe Street. I mean, they're the reconstituted social credit party. The irony is, people would have thought an NDP government would have done something, but again, things shift over time. When they were in opposition and the social credit were in power, the NDP would go on, for days at a stretch, pointing out scams and frauds and swindles on the stock market here. Now they're in power. They don't want to be, there's a range of things. Don't want to appear as anti-business, etc., etc. They don't want to stir up a hornet's nest because the money from Howe Street, the big brokers like Peter Brown, the people in this community who make money off of the dealings of Howe Street, fund politicians. And who are they funding now? Gordon Campbell and the Liberals. So now you have the NDP knowing that no one's going to criticize them. In fact, I spoke to a senior official in Victoria just a couple weeks ago who said the stock market not being cleaned up, they know it's still a problem, but unlike Bingo Gate, it's not going to cause the NDP problems because the beneficiaries are the Liberals. So they're not going to stand up in the House and criticize the NDP for doing nothing. So there's really no constituency that really is organized and is going to take on this issue.
Well, now, Finance Minister Elizabeth Cull did do something. She commissioned a report by Mr. McKenzie, Judge McKenzie. Can you tell us about that?
Well, there's a long story on that, and I've put it, and much more is going to go up on the internet. I've started to put the evidence and the facts and analysis of this whole process up on the internet because...
Well, aren't the facts accessible to anybody?
No, it was what Cull said, what the finance minister said she would do would hold a public inquiry into 2 of the cases of the group that I brought to her attention in March of '94. Again, first, she didn't want to know about it while I worked for her, worked for the government. I go public, she says, we'll hold a public inquiry. Well, of course, the public inquiry was conducted behind closed doors. It was almost entirely conducted inside the offices of the Securities Commission itself, and the transcripts, which were supposed to be made public to anyone who could pay the admission, have not been released. In fact, I've not even seen the testimony of Commission staff, although they were given all of my testimony months ago so that they could then come up with and construct answers to give to this old ex-judge who she appointed to look into it.
What was the bottom line mandate of the review?
The mandate of the review was to determine, the ex-judge Lloyd McKenzie was to determine whether the issuance of receipts for these 2 companies, which we referred to earlier, SciComm International and CamNet Communications Network, if the issuance of approvals, basically, for those 2 companies was prejudicial to the public interest.
Well, how did the discussion of your abilities come to take up so much of the report?
Well, that's a good question. It has nothing to do with the terms of reference. In fact, what McKenzie did is the classic case of shoot the messenger, and I think it's so obviously so that it really hasn't helped them whitewash it, I think, as they'd like. McKenzie, rather than deal with the facts or evidence relating to CamNet and SciComm, went on a personal rant, a diatribe. He devotes much of the synopsis. The only thing that's been made public so far is a synopsis of his conclusions, and he basically just takes a personal attack on myself.
Didn't he call your evidence an intricate knot of loops and tangles, which ties down in no case a concrete
yeah, that was one of the nicer things that he said. Then he went on to lambaste my personality. But that's what he said, and I don't think, again, anyone other than those at the Commission who were wanting this whitewash to begin with believe it. I mean, there have been letters. The former president of the Vancouver Stock Exchange has even written publicly and said there was more than enough evidence to, particularly in the case of SciComm, to stop these receipts. We need a real report. This was a waste of taxpayers' money. In fact, about $100,000 of taxpayers' money was spent on this inquiry, and instead, I mean, well, firstly, there can be a number of reasons. McKenzie doesn't know securities to begin with. He's very old now, and you could assess his abilities. He's either a dishonest individual or he has a bad memory, and this is documented in the things I've put on the public record. He doesn't remember the evidence from one day to the next, so for him, I would expect Dick and Jane reading it could almost seem like an intricate knot of loops and tangles.
Well, now, Bob Scott, former deputy of brokers, said it was a waste of taxpayers' money.
Right.
Would you agree?
I would agree. Well, yes and no. It is a waste of money in the sense that you needn't have spent $100,000 to come up with such a whitewash. In fact, a few buckets of paint could have done the same, or they could have simply, you know, just done nothing about it, which is more their way. But I think it won't be totally useless, because what it will do is always stand, and it will just show, and over time it will increasingly show how this government, the NDP, no different to the governments before it, is not really concerned about cleaning up the stock market. So over time, I think it will become a valuable public, artifact. Right now, well, it's a waste of money and for what it was supposed to do.
Well, has the report actually even been released? And if it hasn't, what's happening to it?
Well, the release of the report has been delayed, and it's more sort of doublespeak from the government. It was supposed to be released in early November. It has yet to be released, and now they're saying they're carefully reviewing it. So who knows when it will be released and what part of it will be released. Clearly the government is planning to censor portions of it. How much or how little, nobody knows. I mean, basically this public inquiry is about as private as it can get.
Let's shift gears. What's leach mining, and why is it so deleterious to the environment?
Well, it's shifting gears, but it all gets
does.
funded through the VSE here and things like that. Heap leach, cyanide leaching, which is of course the thing that's been most infamous in recent cases, is a situation of, simply put, a mining method where they grind up, crunch up the ore and spray mist over it, cyanide, which leaches through, drains through, and extracts the precious metal value, the gold, through it. And then they siphon off, and they have containing ponds where the cyanide is supposed to be kept, and they get the gold, and they do something with the cyanide.
Have there been places in BC where this sort of mining's left a disaster?
Well, the cases that I guess are most well known, you had, we know the cyanide spill, the giant disaster in Colorado at Summitville of Galactic Resources, the Robert Friedland company that left several football field-sized lakes of cyanide that spilled into the Alamosa River and destroyed life there. And has left over $100 million cleanup bill. In BC, there was the Equity silver mine, which has left a $50 million cleanup, although there's work being done on remediation, etc. But again, it was an environmental disaster.
Now there was a mine also on Queen Charlotte Island, Sonola, I believe.
Oh, Sonola, sure.
What happened there?
The Sonola history is actually not one that you may know as much or more than me. Sonola is not one of the case files or the companies that I've really had a chance to look at.
Apparently there was a similar situation with the damage to one of their main salmon rivers. Do you think that environmental regulations have affected this type of mining in BC? And it appears that they have. Maybe they haven't, but it also appears that the mining community has moved now down to South America and other places where the regulations are much more lax.
Well, again, it's in a way, although of course there's been more movement in the environmental areas and then there have been in the white collar or corporate areas, but regulations only go so far. It's the regulators and the attitude and the mindset that's necessary. I think another big cyanide spill just occurred in the last 6 months in Guyana, one of the biggest environmental disasters in that country, called the Omai gold mine. And that also was a company that originally was financed through the same individual, Robert Friedland. The engineering firm, Knight Piesold, who did the work at Omai, also did work consulting at the Summitville disaster. Right now, there's a proposed mine site called the Huckleberry to go into northern BC. And the attitude coming from the BC Ministry of Environment, regardless of regulations, regardless of environmental review processes, is that, again, they're still, I think, biased towards money and jobs first, rather than some sort of balance with the environment. I mean, it's the economy is driving this thing. They're trying to sort of rush through and put an imperative on getting things done, while there are people very concerned and wanting to know, is this going to be safe for the future? You know, it's a lot of the Aboriginal groups, people in the community. I mean, obviously jobs are important and necessary, but the government has to find some sort of balance, and I don't think that's there yet. I think we're still weighted towards pro-industry, pro-commercial interests.
Can you tell us about your latest work, a hard look at a soft review?
Well, that began when I started to realize, again, the learning curve for me. Not only did I learn what the government bureaucracy was about being in there, but I realized that this McKenzie inquiry was going to be a whitewash and was going to basically be sealed, and they were going to try and suppress the evidence and the facts and you know, shoot the messenger, blame me. So I wrote in hard copy and published in September, over a month before McKenzie came out with his report. I started exposing the processes of how the NDP had basically set about whitewashing things, and also how politics is often opposed to the public interest, and basically how things work in British Columbia to protect white-collar crime in a sense. That is a continuing writing project. There's going to be 2 more volumes made public, and what I've done more recently to get wider access for this information is I've put all of the hard look at a soft review up on the internet. And it's called a hard look at a soft review is because that's what Elizabeth Cull and her handlers labeled it, a soft review. It had no legal status, no teeth. It was an informal soft review of matters.
Can you just give us a hypothetical scam, we'll say, that might originate on the VSC? How it works, who it affects, where they get the money, who gets hurt?
Well, in very general terms, because there's all sorts of permutations, and I could explain you scams for hours.
Just use one that's just taken place. Or.
You know, the typical deal now would be seed stock would be raised out of people in the small community here of insiders. In fact, interestingly enough, the liberal finance critic owns shares in the company did own shares in the company that's proposing to put the mine up at Huckleberry. So anyway, you have a pool of shareholders, friends, neighbors, politicians, insiders on Howe Street, buy up the initial shares, get it listed on the exchange, and then start telling your story about how it's going to have the biggest copper mine since the whatever Afton, and then you could say you've got the greatest computer, it's the new IBM. You basically promote it, tell the story, and what's increasingly happening today is they're finding victims, investor victims, through mutual funds, Canadian mutual funds, American funds, European investor funds, pension funds. So rather than, it used to be promoters would go and try and do the routine, a sucker born every day, and tell people their story. People got wise. When the VSC got its reputation in the last 5 or 10 years as the scam cap of the world, investors since '87, small investors, the widows and orphans types, have cleared out. Now they trust fund managers to look after their money for them. So who do the promoters go to? Rather than finding 1,000 small individuals to steal $1,000 from, well, they can go to a fund manager, and through whatever means, be it legitimate or illegitimate, we've had cases of bribery, fund managers getting bribed. Anyway, they will then invest $1 million or more in this same scam stock. So you get it listed, you make up a story about what the company's going to do, there's a kernel of truth, and then you raise it up and blow out those shares you bought at 25 cents, sell them at $5 or $10 to someone who's a mutual fund investor.
And that's how the promoters make the profits?
That's one of the ways, yeah. There are other ways. I mean, that's one sort of basic scenario, and there's all sorts of other ones we could go into.
Adrian, we've got to do this again, but our time's up for now.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
For Contact and Anderson's Restaurant, I'm Craig Delahunt. Please join us again next time.